Well, I'm lighting the flaming chalice, or trying. Almost got it. Hmm. Well, it's, there we go. There we go. Ouch. Okay. Very good. Well, here is a flaming chalice. And the reading this morning is from Frederick Douglass. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice which will be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. We have this morning Bob Fulkerson, a founder of the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada, which goes back to 1994. He has served as executive director until 2019. He's also been executive director of Citizen Alert, a statewide grassroots environmental justice organization prior to 1994. As adjunct faculty at UNR, he taught classes on oppression and privilege. He is a fifth generation Nevadan. He was on the staff of Senator Paul Laxalt while attending George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He's a 2006 to 7 fellow in the Rockwood Leadership Program's year-long National Fellowship for Transformative Leadership in the Nonprofit Sector, and a recipient of the Leadership for a Changing World Award from the Ford Foundation. He received the Arcus Social Justice Leadership Fellowship at Kalamazoo College in 2011. The city of Reno has recognized him as one of the 150 citizens who've made a major difference since the city's founding. And Bob's going to take us back to that founding, I believe, this morning. He loves his family, teaching yoga, folk music, the Great Basin itself, and the Sierra Nevadas. And Bob, the podium is yours.
Thank you. And thanks so much, everybody, for joining this presentation this morning. Really appreciate your interest in this. And it's great to be in this community of with my fellow Unitarian Universalists of Northern Nevada. I'd like to open with a land acknowledgement that my friend, Dr. Deborah Harry, a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, helped me to write. Living in Reno, we are on traditional territory of the Paiute and Washoe people, and we honor the people who have been living here since time immemorial. We recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on this land, and to seek to understand our place within that history. Colonialism is a current, historical, and an ongoing process. We need to build our mindfulness about our participation in it as a first step towards decolonization. Let us begin this morning with a moment of reflection to offer our recognition, our respect, and our commitment to repair. And now we're going to view a brief video by my friend Buck Sampson, who is speaking. This is when he was speaking at the 2016 Hillside Cemetery ceremony and protest when developers sought to dig up his ancestors' graves to make way for UNR housing. He's speaking about the history of his Paiute people in this area. He's the grandson of Dewey and Adele Sampson, and Dewey Sampson was the first Indigenous person elected to the Nevada legislature.
We have the Disigi Band of Paiute, our territory right here, and it's well documented. All the way from these mountains, all the Truckee Meadows, all that you can see all around us. Our Indian people are living here. We have records. We've got burial sites around here. Look at the train track trench. They got old bones down over there. But all around Reno, our people are buried. Not just here, but a long time ago. One of our biggest areas that we had was over here at Peavine Mountain, Akukai. That's one of our main areas right there too. To us, it's a sacred site. This is a sacred site where I rest our people. Peacemaker right here, and his kids are right here also. So this is what we have. Our Indian people were living just right over here. By the university, there was a band of 100 Tziggits over here before the university came by and bought the land from underneath them and moved them out. They moved a couple other places. Over here, university, along the waterways over here. They moved over there by off of Valley Road. They moved over by Timberway, over by Hug, over by Idlewild Park. The same people come by, fought with them and pushed them off, shooting at their camps and stuff like that, raising heck with our people. They moved all the way to the other side of Rattlesnake Mountain. They stayed over there. Finally, they got tired. Then they wrote a letter to the Indian agent asking for some land to be set aside for them. There was Harry Sampson and Dewey, and they taught Nick Dowington how to write his name, and he did. And that letter was sent off back in around 1915. Then we got land down by the Reno Sparks Indian Colony, but it's not the land that we wanted. Our land used to be over there where Washoe Medical Center is, but the non-Indians didn't like Indians too close to town. So they made the Indian agent pick them up and move them on the other side of Kiski Lane where we're at now. So our people are all around here, way before the coming of the white man. And if you look at the laws, if you look at the time dates, the timeline, the immigrants, the non-Indians, they've only been in our part of the country for about 177 years. 170, that's not very long. Where our people have been here thousands and thousands and thousands of years. We got proof of it. And this is all our part where the Indians were at, and now we're being forced to remove again. Our people that were laid to rest, they want to move them again. This is desecration of a sacred site. All the other people that's born here, that's buried here, all the ones that have died here, some of the founders that had shaped Reno are buried here. Some of their relatives, we have some famous people that's here in this cemetery. But yet, people, they don't realize the other side of death. When they're buried, they're laid to rest. When they're buried, people offer prayers. People offer offerings. And if they dig them up and move them, that's irreplaceable. You can't go back. You can only mimic it. You don't know what they said 100 years ago. You don't know what the words were, what the prayers were. This is what's going to happen if we let it go. We have to take care of these things. We're asking everybody that's got relatives here, Hillside Cemetery, to help us. Back us up. Everybody can do something, do a part to help. I thank you.
This isn't a comprehensive or a deep analysis of our racial history in Reno. It's just a snapshot of that up until from about 1860 to 1962 that has been whitewashed for too long. I want to acknowledge the contributions in the work of Geralda Miller, Kenny Dalton of Our Story, Alicia Barber, Guy Rocha, Elmer Rusko, Buck Sampson, Norm Harry, Nevada Women's History Project, the Shared History Project, the University of Nevada Oral History Project of this presentation, and of course, Nevada's greatest living historian, Dr. James W. Hulse, for my inspiration. I've strived for accuracy, but any mistakes are entirely Dr. Hulse's fault. No, actually, they're my fault. And if anybody does see any mistakes, just please let me know. So let's talk about Myron Lake for a minute. Myron came to the Honey Lake Valley north of Reno. They were called the Never Sweats up there because there was so much grass and everything that they didn't have to do a lot of haying. And so they didn't have to sweat bringing in the hay or planting hay or anything because the natural grasses just grew so prolifically. He moved to the Truckee Meadows in 1861 and bought a bridge from the previous owner, a guy named Fuller. So Fuller's Crossing became Lakes Crossing before it became Reno. He was making about $250 to $300 a day to charge people to come across his crossing at a time when the Comstock miners, who were the highest paid in their profession in the world, were earning $4 a day. And he was soaking them. His wife took Mrs. Jane Lake took the extremely unusual move at the time for taking him to court and winning a suit against him for extreme mental and physical cruelty. This is the picture that got me really interested in Reno history. It was used a lot during the 150th anniversary, and it was painted in 1882, and it's called Reno 20 Years Ago. And supposedly it depicts Chief Winnemucca at Lakes Crossing with Myron Lake. That building there was the forerunner of the Riverside Hotel. And I just want to explain a little bit about what's wrong with that picture. In 1862, and this is depicted, there was so much tension between whites and the local indigenous peoples that it renders such a friendly encounter unlikely. Farrell Egan, in his book Sand in the Whirlwind, writes that the winters were bitterly cold at that time, but the Indians refused blankets from well-being Renoites and told them to go away because they were afraid they were going to be poisoned. And you notice that the native people are holding rifles, but that year in 1862, the territorial legislature passed a law to disarm native peoples in the territory. There was a lot of tension because of the water sources, the sacred pinyon pine nut groves, which is a major food source. The clear cutting was depriving the native people of their food, and they were fighting back, and so the legislature wanted to take away their guns. Isaac Roop, at that time, in his diary, the first territorial governor of Nevada, who was a friend of Lake's, talked about their attitude towards native people at that time. And he wrote in his diary about a night out hunting just north of Reno, and quote, "All told, we bagged 2 grizzlies, 1 antelope, and a digger squaw." Rewards ranged from $5 per severed head for an indigenous person in Shasta City in 1855 to 25 cents for a scalp in Honey Lake Valley in 1863, where the territory which was the territory of Old Winnemucca, who is depicted here. He tried in vain to get monetary compensation for Honey Lake Valley. About the same time that Lake was doing his work in Reno, there was slavery was an accepted fact. And in fact, look at this front page story in 1863 in the Gold Hill News, casually mentioning a Negro girl of 11 years old being sold in Virginia, followed by the line, "The time cannot be named when property sold so cheap for Spanish beef brings a higher price in California." As told in the book Ghosts of Gold Mountain by Gordon Chang, 90% of the workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad across Nevada were Chinese. Dr. Chang writes that today there's nothing extant in their own words about their experiences. We do know that they built the railroad and that the railroad built Reno. In fact, one report from the Central Pacific Railroad said Reno appeared like magic within a month after the arrival of the railroad. The Chinese in Nevada and throughout the rest of the West experienced extreme anti-Chinese violence from their earliest days. One observer of Chinese life wrote to officials in Washington, "In no other civilized country would the Chinese be barred from the right to testify against those who had wronged them in person or property." He believed that hundreds of Chinese had been brutally murdered in Nevada and California, with the perpetrators known but unpunished. And throughout, they felt that the Chinese were depriving whites of work, and there was an organization called the Reno Working Men, which was a vigilante association of Reno businessmen and workers. And here they're talking about warning them to beware of hemp and the working man, and that hemp is a reference to lynching. On August 3rd, 1878, a fire swept through Chinatown, and according to newspaper reports, a Chinese man and a Chinese woman were both killed. Maybe more were, but those are the official reports. The previous month, a contract to build a steamboat ditch had gone to a Chinese-run company from San Francisco. This didn't sit well with the Reno Workingmen's Association, and they were suspected of causing the arson, which forced the residents to move across the river and rebuild. In 1878, the Reno newspaper said, "The heathen regards maybe no law save that of game. Their lives, property, and our citizens would be safer, and there would be less safety for thieves and murderers, and the health of our river would be greatly improved if we put them out to the sagebrush." Four days after Reno's Chinatown was burned, Boise City was also burned to the ground. And Reno began to move the Chinese further out so that they could make way for the Fairground Pavilion where the original Chinatown was. The Gazette-Journal printed the Reno Working Man's platform on the front page in August of 1878, saying the Chinese existence is detrimental to the further welfare of our country, and called for their harassment and called for their expulsion and other violent harassment. And for months after the burning, article after article appeared that the townspeople of Reno wanted the Chinese to not rebuild. And one article mentioned, it seems that Carson, Virginia, which is Virginia City, and other towns have driven them out, and now they're flocking to Reno in droves. There is deep feeling against the location of Chinatown anywhere near the Reno proper. Now, this article, it says a distinguished Nevadan, and that distinguished Nevadan went by the name of Canty. His real name was Ingersoll, but he was the working man who, and in the bottom of the article, it says he gets the credit of having to start the fire which destroyed Chinatown, and he lived, he was honored for that. They did have a grand jury that looked into it, but they didn't find anything. Nobody would testify. And so the Chinese stayed, and they built a new Chinatown, which is basically where the old Boondocks restaurant used to be around First and Lake Street. Newspaper talked about how they can accumulate all the filth they want without fear of being disturbed, and the rock of the hoodlum will be rarer than of old because it was further out of town. Now we're going to flash forward to the after 13 years after the burning of Chinatown to the year 1891, and that was the year Reno townspeople lynched a Mexican man from the Virginia Street Bridge. And it was in September of 1891, a Mexican man named Ortiz. We don't know if that's his first name or his last name. He just, everything I could find is just the name Ortiz. He was accused of shooting and wounding Reno Marshal Dick Nash. Reno mob broke into the Washoe County Jail, took him to the Virginia Street Bridge, and lynched him. And for decades, according to a newspaper account from 1908, at Armenco's office supply store, his picture was shown on Virginia Street at this office supply store. I used to shop at Armenko's store. It was there for a long time, right there on Virginia Street. And then 15 years after the Ortiz lynching in 1904, the Nevada State Journal headline announced that all unemployed Negroes were ordered to leave Reno. They were simply told to go, and if the order was not obeyed, they would be locked up. 4 years after the unemployed Blacks were ordered to Reno, and 30 years after the first Chinatown was burned, the Reno Town Fathers again burned Chinatown to the ground. This time, no warning was given, and it caused international outcry by Chinese from San Francisco to the East Coast to appeal to President Roosevelt to take action. Now, the more than 60 dwellings were burned and hundreds of people were homeless in the snow. The grand jury was headed by Gulling of Gulling Road fame, sanctioned the arson. And in 1908, the Reno Evening Gazette said, the first shack to be demolished belonged to a nameless old Joss and a Negro prostitute by the name of Bertha. One wonders if they're potentially unlawful in the eyes of many citizens. Immoral miscegenation determined their elevated status as the preeminent targets of the health board directive. The two were thrown out in the cold. So it's only the Gazette also lauded, and people lauded Gulling and the grand jury foreman, Charles Gulling, saying that they did their work with vigor and intelligence. Just wanted to mention this guy here, Arzo Eugene Cheney. I've always wondered who Cheney Street was named after. He impaneled a grand jury to investigate the Reno lynching of Ortiz and said that the hanging of Ortiz is nothing less than a murder, and it's the duty of all abiding citizens to raise their hands against these proceedings. To permit them to pass unpunished is to make ourselves sympathizers with the crime. And then he impaneled another grand jury that led to the dismantlement of the 601, which was similar to the Reno working men, but the 601 committees were active throughout the West and were also vigilante forces. Reno had a Japanese newspaper in 1913. The editor was Webster Kazuo, who was a graduate of Columbia Law School. And at that time, he said there were 110 Japanese in the Reno-Sparks area and 200 throughout the state of Nevada. In 1906, there were 75 Japanese who were employed by the Western Pacific Railroad. And then in 10 years after unemployed Blacks were ordered to leave Reno, and 6 years after the burning of Chinatown, this headline appeared, and all along the Southern Pacific Railroad towns, which are Lovelock, Winnemucca, Battle Mountain, Palisade, and Elko, they were making war on unemployed Negroes. And that year, or in 1912, Senator Francis Newlands, who got his money the old-fashioned way, which is by marrying the daughter of the mining railroad baron, William Sharon, introduced legislation federally to disenfranchise Blacks. He had always refused to sell lands to Blacks or Jews, and Renoites honored him by naming a neighborhood and a park after him. What happened, there was this idea of the so-called yellow peril, and in Reno and in Nevada, there was a great outcry for Nevada to pass a law similar to what California had done to ban or restrict Japanese immigration. And they talk about the existence of a Japanese colony within Reno, and decrying that again, they were taking too many jobs from local white people. And no doubt a lot of that led to the activity of the KKK. And they were very active in Reno throughout the 20s. The biggest thing happened in 1924, where they were lined 4 and 5 deep and went out to Moana Resort for a giant celebration where thousands of people supposedly came. There was fireworks, and that was at Moana Springs, and we'll hear about that in a minute. 1924, there was also a giant cross burning up on Peavine Mountain. They say about 1,500 people showed up for that. Let's talk for a minute about the Reno Sparks Indian Colony. According to an oral history, the colony was served by a water system that was built in 1923 with a central well, which was discovered to be contaminated and was causing all kinds of gastrointestinal illnesses and likely a lot of deaths. In fact, over the 12 years, there were dozens of funerals of people who died in the colony, and at least 7 or 8 of them were infants, suspected to be because of the poisoned well. The oral history, this is from the Reverend Clyde Matthews, who Dr. Holst sent me to, his oral history that was done in 1969. He said, "I heard stories of police killing Indians. A policeman would take his blackjack and take 3 or 4 Indians down to the river and try it out on them. He was charged with kicking 1 Indian woman in vital places. Finally, he was dismissed, but was able to get away with that for a long time." It's interesting that in Reno's Chinatown was still talked about as late as 1932. And this talks about a Japanese barber who went out of business when there was a boycott against it by the Chinese because of the Chinese invasion against Japanese land. Anyway, but it talked about how his barber shop was once the morning rendezvous for the neighborhood when the Chinese tea merchant, herb doctor, and laundryman came to be shaved and swap Chinatown's gossip. So the Reno's Black history goes way back, at least until 1938, and you can see at the Bethel AME Church, which is still there at 945 Bell Street. In fact, it's the most significant building, one of the most significant buildings in our state associated with African American and the civil rights movement. Also interested to find a lot more about Leona Love, who gave sermons there. Her family was from Elko. And you can see that there's a long-standing tradition of Black History Week being celebrated in Reno, going back as far as 1938. Paul Robeson came to Reno a couple times, and he was famous, of course, for his beautiful voice, but also for his Black activism and his left leanings. He came at least twice in 47 and 48, performed at the Majestic and Granada theaters, and would conclude his performance with a lecture on Black human rights. In 1947, the group that would sponsor him said that they didn't want him anymore because they didn't want his lectures. And you can read names like James Santini, Robert Z. Hawkins, and there was a founder of the local Sierra Club who all publicly condemned his visit. So Robeson wasn't allowed to stay in Reno hotels. Instead, he stayed at the home of Reno Jewish lawyer Charlotte Hunter Arley, who was one of the first 3 women lawyers in Nevada. In fact, the first 3 out of 4 women lawyers in Nevada were Jewish. The following year, he performed it at a Nevada Progressive Party fundraiser at the Reno Oddfellows Hall that included speeches also by UNR students for the candidate Henry Wallace. And at that event, Robeson made the very controversial statement that we must extend democracy to all who do not have it. As noted in the book, Jews in Nevada, the Seroptimists of Reno expelled Charlotte Hunter Arley for her association with Robeson and her perceived left leanings. But she was practiced well into her 80s, and one of her last cases was defending an immigrant against deportation. You know, we hear a lot about Bill Harris starting the gambling empire through a little bingo parlor in 1937, but we don't hear a lot about two Japanese business people, Fred Aoyama and Fred Yamagishi, who opened the first bingo parlor in 1934. They were also, they had to close it after Pearl Harbor, though, because they were classified as enemy aliens and their money was impounded by the federal government. So they rented it to Bill Harris on a sublease, and they had to sue him for unlawful occupation of the site, which lasted for several years. Between 1931, when Nevada legalized gambling, and 1965, when we finally passed the Civil Rights Act, African Americans were banned from gambling or even being present in a casino. Blacks were not allowed in any casinos except for a couple places on Lake Street, said Dolores Feemster in one of her histories. Black soldiers at Stead Air Force Base would come downtown and attempt to go to a casino, but they were told they had to go to Lake Street. Bill Fong was a Chinese immigrant, a World War II veteran, and he was also a friend of my grandfather's. His new China, this is him pictured there, his new China Club opened in 1952 at 2nd and Lake Streets. It was the first integrated casino in Nevada. He worked with the NAACP and provided scholarships for students of color at UNR, and he closed it in 1971. And then in 72, he opened a Chinese restaurant at the El Cortez, which was down there in the basement that some of us remember going to. Langston Hughes visited Reno for the first time in 1934. He was 10 years into a career that made him the most recognizable and controversial African-American writer of his time. He paid $2.50 a week and lived in a boarding house at the home of a widow, Helen Hubbard, whose husband was also active in civil rights. And he said that he enjoyed swell blues and jazz at the local colored club. He also wrote that Reno, quote, was a very prejudiced town with no public places where Negroes could eat other than two cheap Chinese restaurants. It had no Negro sections except for a scrubby little area across the railroad tracks where the colored club for gambling was located. He spent time with acclaimed boxer Kid Chocolate, who the press called the Reno colored comer because he boxed in Reno so much, even though he was from Cuba. And that's where this picture of him taken in the white suit was from, when he was in Cuba. Audre Lorde writes, "When you read the words of Langston Hughes, you are reading the words of a Black gay man." This is a photo of him in 1934 at Pyramid Lake. Housing discrimination was not taken off the books until 1971, when under the threat of federal court action, the Reno legislature finally banned it. Around 1950, Black families started moving to Black Springs, even though the area had no services like running water or even wells. The first place for Blacks to own property, since Reno's CC&Rs banned renting or selling to Blacks, was out there at Black Springs. Ollie Westbrook and his family, pictured here, were one of the first to buy property there, and then they couldn't get loans to build. In her book, A Cry for Help, Helen Townsell Parker relates the story of how her grandparents, the Westbrooks, and other families purchased in Black Springs and how they built their lives there. May Carthen moved to Black Springs in 1956, and she told Ken Dalton that she will always remember that area as Black Springs, even though the name has been changed now to Grandview Terrace since 1990. And you can see Ken Dalton's Our Story for more of that history and more other Black history in Nevada. About the time when Black Springs was being formed, a thing called Operation Wetback was launched. It was in 1954, and these are local headlines from the Gazette Journal, our local Reno paper of that year, talking about how the US is being invaded by 2 million or more Mexicans per year. This is the biggest peacetime invasion ever. So they said, we want raids with military style precision and support of the Nevada Highway Patrol. This is a picture of some of them working on the railroad outside of Reno. And it was the same year in 1954 that Senator Pat McCarran, that we named a road after, and a whole airport, which has since is being changed now, but that road has not, and we need to do that. But the same year, Pat McCarran said that the flow of migrants from Mexico was a conduit for communist agents. All they wanted was to work. So we're back to Moana Springs now. And in 1956, Reverend C.A. Crosby took his boys, he had a club there called the Highway Boys. They were from Northside School, and he took them there to swim. It was an integrated group of black and white boys. And the owner, a guy named Bill Barham, who had inherited Moana Springs from his father, let some of the boys in, but not the two black boys. And so Reverend Crosby, the following week, went to the Reno City Council to make an appeal to the city council. Do you want discrimination in this town? And the city council wouldn't let him speak. They wouldn't even let him speak. So he persisted, and he did get a letter from the Reno mayor who said there would be no more discrimination at the pool. Crosby was a persistent figure in Black civil rights in Reno. He was the one that offered the invocation for Paul Robeson's funeral fundraiser for the Progressive Party in 1947. He ran for the Assembly in 1954 and got over 7,000 votes. There's a memorial that celebrates Lou Barham, the guy that banned the black boys from swimming. It's interesting to note that his father hosted the KKK at the Moana Resort in 1924. And his brother was Ted Barham, the Reno's police chief from 1955 to 1959. In August of 1958, Alice Smith, who was the NAAC president from the previous 2 years, and U.S. Woodard, who succeeded her as the president, Reverend C.A. Crosby, and other black leaders met with Governor Charles Russell. This, I think, is probably one of the first photographs of a Nevada governor with a group of meeting with a group of black activists. And they met with Russell to discuss conducting a survey and a study of Nevada conditions relative to minority groups. And that would plant the seeds for the Nevada Equal Rights Commission. The following month, the Reno, the Las Vegas, and the Hawthorne branches of the NAACP, and Hawthorne had a thriving branch of the NAACP because of the Army Depot and blacks being stationed there. They again met with Charlie Russell, the governor, to press him to introduce a civil rights law into the 1959 legislature, which would not be passed until 1965. After the federal law was passed. Reno historian Geralda Miller said in 3 weeks, the 1960 Olympic Games and the Civil Rights Movement, where this is taken from, that the Olympics marked a turning point in the Black civil rights movement. She explained that Reno's openly racist culture was a direct affront to Olympian ideals and everything the games stood for and symbolized. As the games approached, all eyes were on Reno. So they started a letter writing campaign. They did a rally inviting Governor Sawyer to speak. And they held a major conference in November, at which got other civil rights leaders to come and really stepped up things to light a fire. And what happened is that fierce organizing among black leaders like Eddie Scott and Bertha Woodard resulted in the first big civil rights protest at Woolworths in downtown Reno in 1960. The following year, the Reno Sparks NAACP led a demonstration at the Overland Cafe at Commercial Row and Center Streets. This is some, and then in the summer of 1963, a mass car caravan left Reno to go to the Lincoln Memorial to be with Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, and Eddie Scott led that. There's been he was an amazing figure in Reno civil rights history. This is him 5 years ago, last week, actually on March 12th. That's the picture there on the left, because he planned to say congratulations on your takeover of Adam Laxalt's office. He's the biggest threat to civil rights that I've seen in this state, and you've got to keep it up. And I'll be at the NAACP meeting tonight. Will you come there? And I said, yes. And so we came, and and that's him right there. In 1961, more than 200 African Americans picketed and marched in Carson City, which is probably the first time. It was the first time that any protesters, let alone African American and Black people, were protested and marched in the state capitol. And that's Eddie Scott with a sign there on the left. And what happened is people working across the state line, because they also, the Nevada travel agency was opening in San Francisco just to serve the Nevada market. And so NAACP people from Reno and from San Francisco went there. They protested. Governor Sawyer was there. He was not happy, I imagine. Liberace, and they said that they advertise these tours, but when a Negro tries to buy a ticket, he is told there isn't any room. And because between Reno and Salt Lake City at the time, there were just 2 hotels that served Blacks. And in March 31st of 61, this shows the major impact that the NAACP's takeover of the coffee shop at the Overland Hotel had in Reno. And I would encourage you to, in fact, I'll drop in the chat when I can, the link to a great video that was made about this time that features our historian Geraldo Miller speaking about that. In 1962, the NAACP told Governor Sawyer to use the Gaming Control Board to enforce civil rights in Reno and Las Vegas casinos, but he wouldn't do it. And so a year later, Black leaders of Nevada, including Dr. Charles West, Eddie Scott, and others, decried Governor Sawyer's failure to include civil rights in the legislative session. And the Gazette-Journal sanctimoniously editorialized that it has been characteristic of the Negro leaders to react churlishly to the slightest setback, often hurting their best friends in the process. Immense progress has been made, particularly in Nevada, but it requires understanding, consideration, and forbearance on both sides of the fence, not just from the lawmakers. And now we're going to hear from Geraldo Miller speaking about the impact of that Overland Hotel protest. Oops.
Probably for them, from my oral histories, it was that for them it was a very, very strong accomplishment. It was a personal accomplishment for many of those activists who participated that day, that, they stood up for themselves and went to this place where they normally weren't allowed and said, I belong here.
So we're going to conclude just by showing that in Nevada and in the United States, in Washoe County, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities continue to endure the worst outcomes in every indicator, from economic inequality, poverty rates, health outcomes, and incarceration. The Black poverty rate is 3 times higher than the white poverty rate in Nevada, and their incarceration rate is 4 times higher per capita than the white incarceration rate. Hate crimes against Asian American people are an all-time high across the country. Just in March, there's an estimated 100 per day. And it, William Faulkner's observation, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past, is apt. But the UUs and others have been persisting, and our friend Agnes Howe, who's a lot of us remember as a member of the UU Fellowship. She was active in the Palace Sit-ins in San Francisco. She was one of the first members of the Culinary in Reno, and she wrote this letter in 1994 that said, "I agree that Little Mississippi is not a description of Nevada. In many ways, Nevada was worse." And she talked about Skipper Mills of the Mills brother saying, quote, "I hate Reno for what they've done to my people." But in 1961, which that article is from on the right, it shows that the Unitarians have been involved in this issue for a long time. And in fact, the UU sponsored a meeting and also were active as far back in 1961 in these issues. Because the UUs, we understand that our privileges that we enjoy as white people, we are a primarily white congregation. We understand that those privileges that we enjoy living in Reno and in the United States are based on a history of violently enforced structural racism, which benefits us at the expense of Black, Indigenous, and people of color community members. And I'm proud that the UUs have been at this for a long time. And now it's time to redouble our efforts. And with that, this presentation is concluded. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Bob. We don't have any in the chat yet, so I'll ask folks to either enter their questions in the chat if you don't want to be seen on screen, or take yourself off of mute to ask Bob a question.
What is this picture, this image of the Black boy lying flat on his stomach with his hand?
Yeah. Hi, Mom. Nice to see you. That is the Black Lives Matter protest in Carson City this summer, for the this summer in Carson.
Bob, we do have a question that you mentioned Jim Santini. Did you remember mean Clark's brother? He would have been too young in 1948.
Let's see. Maybe it was the father. Maybe it was James Santini Sr. It just said James Santini. The article says James Santini, and so is it possible that it was the father?
Okay.
Gaia has a question.
She entered just Bob's name. I haven't seen the question yet. So Gaia, if you want to finish your question or come off mute.
Sorry, it's great, actually. Bob, nice to see you on screen, and thanks for the sobering hour here. We've been debating at home about renaming things, and I would wonder if there's a coherent kind of position that you might have in regards to how far we go with renaming things where they're associated with this kind of discrimination and racism in the past. We were interested in one recently there was a sculpture somewhere, I think in Chicago, maybe, that the sculptor was known to be a racist, but the person or the thing sculpted, of course, wasn't unconnected.
No,
And
this is the.
I'm sorry, it was here. It was here. It was actually
Yes,
here in Reno.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
beg your
yes,
pardon.
yes.
So,
Mackey.
yeah, the Mackey thing, I guess it was at the university, right? So I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you have any thoughts on that issue.
No, I appreciate that. It's a great question, and I've thought a lot about it, and a couple things. One is that, all the Confederate markers, should come down, all the Confederate, but that also I am a huge supporter of women's rights and women's equality. And if we took all the statues of men down that didn't support that, there wouldn't be a gosh darn statue left in the country, probably,
He's right.
for them. And I think that it's really important that that we also go to the people who are most directly impacted and take direction to see what their views and feelings are on these issues, and not just leave it up to the those of us who are quote unquote woke. The other thing is that people need to understand our history, and I think it's much better to invest in public schools and public education, and to allow people to really understand who some of these statues, who they were, so we can have discussions about them, other than like pretending they never existed. And then we also need to do more to name things and have monuments up to people like Bertha Woodard, Eddie Scott, the Japanese family in Gerlach, who was, when the railroad town came, after World War during World War II, when they were kicked out in the desert, had to live out in the desert with no running water, no heat, no toilets during the winter time. And they endured, people like them, the Bertha, the one that was kicked out of Chinatown, people, real people we need to honor and lift up, not just these old, white men who made a lot of money by exploiting other people.
Jenny, did you have a question?
It seems like we need a monument to Chinatown itself. In the location where it used to exist, because I think very few Renoites know that story.
Yeah, there is one up at Rancho San Rafael, a small pagoda monument replica was dedicated up there several years ago. But yeah, there's nothing there. There's nothing marking, the lynching of Ortiz on the Virginia Street Bridge, anything like that. And there's, you saw Buck Sampson talking about their indigenous name for Peavine Mountain, in their name, both Washoe and Paiute, it translates into Sunflower Mountain, but how do, and I won't try to pronounce how they pronounce it, but it's, I think, going back to calling the names in their real names, their true names, the names of the first people here, is also a first step towards decolonization and recognition.
We do have a number of questions in the chat. You've addressed some of them, but the first question that came in, another question that came in, Bob, was about your research methodology, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Email Jim Hulse, and then call Geraldo Miller, and then look up our story, and Ken Dalton's work. Call my friends at the Reno Sparks Indian Colony, things like that. Talk to people who knew people, first of all, and then that look at old newspaper recordings, and then I just go down one rabbit hole after another. I mean, there's just so much, and that's why I wanted this to be a full state history, of civil rights and a racial history, but there's just too much, and so it's hard to know when to cut things off. And I credit Geraldo was saying just cut it off at 1960. around 1960, because that's when the real turning point came. But then after that, there's a huge amount, I mean, of progress, of struggle, of resistance that needs to be written about as well. Anyway, but yeah, so I have no methodology. I just kind of like, just whatever looks interesting, make a few phone calls, write it down, Google stuff, things like that. I'm not really a student. I'm just a curious person that has a lot of opinions.
Oh, did we just, not sure what happened with Bob there.
He pulled one of his Zoom freezes.
Bob, are you still there?
Well, Bob, for when you come back to us, I have a question, and that is, have you considered putting all this into a book? I might not get my answer.
May not. It's interesting. We'll give him a minute, and then maybe we'll have to. Yeah, he just dropped off.
Uh-oh. Well, while we're waiting for Bob to come back, let me say that in 2 weeks, Stacy Montooth, who is Governor Sisolak's appointee as executive director of the Nevada Indian Commission, will be speaking to us about the challenges that Native Americans in Nevada still face. So I think we're all looking forward to that capstone on Bob's excellent presentation this morning. Bob, are you back yet?
He is not.
Oh.
So I think, Kevin, we're just going to have to, unfortunately, wrap it up at this point. I don't see him coming back in, and it seems like we're at time.
Very good. Well, thank you all for being with us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everybody.